My name is Elisa Collier. I'm 80 years old, and I've been doing laundry for more than 50 years. One thing I learned early is that you don't need a shelf full of expensive products to get clothes clean. My mother used less soap, saved hot water for when she needed it, and paid attention to what each piece of clothing actually required. Some of those old habits can still save money and protect your clothes. They cut down the work your washer and dryer have to do. One of these takes only a few seconds and can help your dryer work better and more safely. Another can avoid most of the energy normally spent heating wash water. And number one explains what the old idea of a wash day still got right. If you think the old household ways are worth saving, stick with me. Number 10 starts before the clothes ever reach the washer. My mother never washed a shirt just because it had been worn once. If it wasn't stained, sweaty, or truly dirty, she hung it up. She let it air overnight. A blouse worn to church, a sweater worn for a few hours, or a flannel pulled on over another shirt often had another good day left in it. That sounds almost too simple, but every unnecessary wash means more water, more detergent, more drying, and more wear on the fabric. So before I toss something into the hamper, I look at it. I check the collar, the cuffs, and under the arms. If it is still clean, I hang it somewhere with good airflow and give it a little time. Not everything needs another trip through the machine. And when something does need washing, there is another old habit that helps keep the part everybody sees looking better for longer. Number 9 starts before you close the washer door. Number 9, turn dark clothes inside out before you wash them. In our house, anything we wanted to keep looking nice got a little extra attention before it went into the machine. Dark trousers, work shirts, printed cotton, and later on, blue jeans. The outside of a garment takes much of the rubbing during washing. Over time, that friction can make dark colors look tired and printed designs wear down faster. So I turn jeans, dark shirts, and printed clothes inside out before they go in. It takes all of 10 seconds, costs nothing. It gives the visible side of the garment a little less wear. I also prefer cold water for many of those loads. And that brings us to number 8, because this is one of the old habits that can still make a noticeable difference on the household energy bill. Number 8, wash ordinary clothes in cold water when the fabric and the kind of dirt allow it. For years, hot water felt like part of getting things truly clean. That was simply how many of us were taught. But heating wash water takes a large share of the energy involved in running a washing machine. So if an ordinary load of shirts, jeans, towels, or everyday clothes can be cleaned in cold water, there is no reason to pay to heat that water out of habit. I use cold for most of my ordinary laundry now. I still check the care label. I make exceptions when something is heavily soiled, oily, or needs special laundering. Old wisdom isn't about refusing to use the right tool. It means not using more than the situation calls for. That distinction matters. My mother never had a chart explaining laundry energy use. What she did have was a dislike of wasting anything that had to be paid for. Soap, water, heat, clothing. If cold water will do the job, I let it. But water temperature is only part of taking care of clothes. Some garments simply should not be treated like a bath towel. Number 7, Don't wash every piece of clothing the same way. Back then, delicate things were separated before the washing even started. Lace, stockings, bras, and anything with hooks or thin straps did not go tumbling loose with towels and heavy work clothes. Today, I use a simple mesh laundry bag. It keeps smaller pieces from twisting around buttons, zippers, and heavier fabric, while still letting the wash water move through. And some things are better kept out of the washer altogether. If the care label allows it, I still hand wash a delicate sweater in lukewarm water, press the water out gently, and lay it flat to dry instead of stretching it on a hanger. It takes a little more patience, but replacing good clothing costs far more than giving it 5 careful minutes. That was one of the old rules of laundry. Treat the fabric according to what it is, not according to what is easiest. And that same idea applies to stains. Number 6. Treat the stain before you treat the whole shirt. We always kept a plain laundry bar near the sink for exactly that reason. If there was grease on a cuff, dirt around a collar, or a small food stain on a blouse, we worked on that spot first instead of adding more soap to the entire wash. I still do much the same thing. I wet the stained area, work a little appropriate laundry soap into it, and let it sit briefly before the garment goes into the machine. The sooner I catch a stain, the less work it usually takes. That old habit taught me something I use all over the house. Use the cleaner where the dirt is. There is no reason to add extra detergent to an entire load because one shirt has a dirty collar. And that brings me to number 5. Because one of the easiest ways to waste money in the laundry room is using more soap than the load actually needs. Number 5. Measure the detergent instead of pouring it by habit. I learned this one the expensive way. For years, I thought a little extra soap meant a little extra clean. Usually it meant more suds, more product to rinse away, and a bottle that emptied faster than it needed to. These days, I read the directions for the detergent I'm using, look at the size of the load and how dirty the clothes really are, and measure from there. A load of gardening clothes may need more help than a few lightly worn towels. Different washers and detergents have different instructions. The point is not to use as little soap as possible. The point is to use enough, no more and no less. Soap was treated that way when I was young because it cost money. You measured it instead of splashing it in until it looked like enough. And if clothes start feeling stiff or seem poorly rinsed, too much product may be part of the problem. Using enough matters. Using more than enough usually doesn't. There is another place in the laundry room where a little buildup can quietly make a machine work harder. Number 4 takes only a few seconds. Number 4, clean the dryer lint filter every single time. This is such a small habit that I don't even think of it as a chore anymore. Before a load goes into the dryer, I pull out the screen, remove the lint, put it back, and then start the machine. That lint is more than fuzz from your towels. When airflow is restricted, clothes can take longer to dry. And lint buildup is not something you want around a machine producing heat. I think of it as simple housekeeping. Keep the machine clean enough to do the job it was built to do. It costs nothing. It takes seconds. And it is one of those habits people skip precisely because it seems too small to matter. I also keep an eye on the dryer vent and have it cleaned when it needs attention. The lint screen is only one part of keeping a dryer breathing properly. But there is an even cheaper way to reduce the work the dryer has to do. Sometimes don't turn it on at all. Number 3 brings back something that used to be ordinary in many laundry rooms. Number 3, bring back the drying rack. I grew up with wet clothes draped over wooden racks so often it never felt like a money-saving trick. Sweaters were laid flat so they would keep their shape. Blouses and lighter pieces were hung where air could move around them. Anything we worried might shrink or get beaten up in the dryer stayed out of it. I still like a folding rack. It asks for almost nothing. No electricity, no dryer sheet, no dryer cycle at all. Just a little space and some patience. The important part is to put it somewhere with good airflow. Keep it safely away from heaters, open flames, or anything that could overheat the fabric. For delicate clothing especially, slower air drying can mean less stretching, less shrinking, and less wear from being tossed around in a hot drum. We have become so used to machines finishing every household job that waiting a few extra hours can feel inconvenient. Back then, we looked at it differently. If the air could do the work for free, we let it. And when the weather cooperates, there is an even older version of that same idea. Number 2, use the clothesline when the weather gives you the chance. Few household memories are stronger for me than sheets moving on a line in a summer breeze. You could hear the clothespins knocking against the wire. By afternoon, the sheets were dry, and the whole job had been done without the dryer running once. We did not call that energy efficiency. We called it Tuesday. A clothesline will not work for everybody. Some people live in apartments. Some neighborhoods have restrictions. Some people cannot safely carry a heavy basket outside anymore. And sometimes the weather simply refuses to cooperate. That is why I also like a drying rack. But when I can hang towels, sheets, jeans, or sturdy cotton outside, I still enjoy doing it. For dark clothes I want to protect from fading, I hang them in the shade rather than leaving them in harsh sun. Every load that dries in the air is one fewer load that has to tumble in a heated drum. And for many clothes, less time in the dryer can also mean less wear from heat and friction. There is something else I like about a clothesline. It forces you to slow down just enough to notice the clothing in your hands. A loose button, a thinning seam, a stain you missed. Those little things used to be noticed before a garment was ruined. And that leads to number 1, because the biggest old laundry lesson was never really about soap, water, or clotheslines. It was about how often we did laundry in the first place. Number 1, bring back the idea of a real wash day. I do not mean everybody has to spend Monday morning standing over a wash tub. I certainly wouldn't trade my washing machine for one. What I mean is this: stop letting 3 shirts and 2 towels convince you that the washing machine needs to run. When I was younger, laundry accumulated until there was enough to make the work worthwhile. We sorted it, checked the pockets, treated the dirty collars and stains. Then we ran a proper load without packing the machine so tightly that the clothes could not move. That rhythm did something important. It made us think before we washed. A sweater worn for 2 hours might be aired and worn again. A stain might be treated instead of adding extra detergent to the entire load. A small pile might wait until tomorrow instead of becoming another half-empty cycle. Modern machines have made laundry wonderfully convenient. I am very grateful for that. But convenience can easily become repetition. One more load because it is easy. One more scoop because it is easy. One more dryer cycle because it is easy. The older I get, the more I think the lesson underneath all of it was never about being stingy. It was about knowing when enough was enough. Enough soap to clean the clothes, enough water for a proper load, enough heat when heat was actually needed, and enough washing to keep a household clean without wearing out everything in it. That is the old wisdom underneath all 10 of these habits. Take care of what you own, use what you need, and do not make a machine work simply because there is a button you can push. I still use modern detergent. I still use a washing machine. And on plenty of rainy days, I am very grateful for my dryer. Old wisdom is not about pretending everything was better 50 years ago. It is about remembering the habits that still make sense. Wash in cold water when cold will do. Clean that lint screen every load. Let good clothes breathe before washing them again. And wait for a proper load instead of running the machine simply because something landed in the basket. Those little habits do not look impressive. That may be why they are so easy to forget. But over a lifetime of keeping a home, the small things are often where the money, the clothing, and the work are saved. If your mother or grandmother had a laundry habit you still use today, tell me about it in the comments. I would love to know which old ways are still alive in your home. And subscribe if you want to help me keep a few more of them from disappearing. Next time, I want to open the kitchen cupboard because laundry wasn't the only place our mothers knew how to do more with less.